What if everything you thought you knew about African American ancestry was only part of the story? Beneath the surface lies a hidden legacy, one that intertwines the histories of African, Native American, and European peoples in ways far more complex than we've been told. This is a story of erased identities, forgotten tribes, and a rediscovery that could change everything we understand about who we are. Are you ready to uncover the truth? The story of African American ancestry is often painted with a broad brush, a direct lineage to the millions of enslaved Africans forcibly brought to the Americas during the transatlantic slave trade. This narrative, while central and undeniably true, is far from complete. Beneath the surface lies a more intricate web of identities that challenges the conventional understanding of African American heritage. At the heart of this complexity is the largely overlooked connection to Native American ancestry. Historical evidence and emerging genetic research reveal a profound truth. A significant number of African Americans also possess Native American and European ancestry, often in surprising proportions. Genetic studies suggest that while African heritage predominates, averaging about 73.2% in African Americans, there is also an average of 24% European ancestry and 2% Native American ancestry. Yet these statistics do not tell the full story. For many families, the ties to Native American communities go far deeper, reflecting centuries of shared history, intermarriage, and cultural blending. How did this rich, layered heritage become obscure? To answer this, we must look back at the centuries of colonization, slavery, and systemic erasure that shaped the American identity. Early colonial records, misclassifications, and deliberate policies aimed to simplify racial categories, often erasing Native identities in the process. People of mixed African and Native heritage were frequently labeled as colored or black, their indigenous roots systematically stripped away by government records, census classifications, and societal norms. One of the most persistent myths is that African Americans and Native Americans existed as entirely separate communities, with little overlap in their histories or experiences. However, the reality is much more intertwined. From the early days of European colonization, African and Native peoples found themselves bound together by circumstances of survival, resistance, and shared oppression. The story of their interconnectedness is not only about loss, but also about resilience, adaptation, and enduring cultural legacies. What makes this hidden history particularly compelling is how it challenges long-held assumptions about identity. For example, many African Americans have grown up hearing family stories of Indian blood or ancestors from specific tribes. For years, such stories were dismissed as folklore or exaggeration. Yet, modern research increasingly validates these oral histories, providing a clearer picture of how Native American and African ancestries became intertwined. This blending of identities was not always voluntary. Enslaved Africans and Native Americans often formed alliances in response to the brutal conditions of colonization and slavery. During the 17th and 18th centuries, Native American communities faced devastating losses due to war, disease, and the Indian slave trade, which saw many indigenous people forcibly removed from their lands and sold into slavery. At the same time, African slaves were arriving in increasing numbers, and the two groups often shared the same spaces: plantations, frontier settlements, and even wilderness refuges where they fled to escape their oppressors. Despite these connections, colonial authorities actively worked to suppress the recognition of Native ancestry in African American communities. Policies that defined identity solely through skin color or presumed African descent effectively erased the complex histories of mixed heritage individuals. By the 19th century, Many African Americans with Native ancestry had lost all formal recognition of their ties to indigenous tribes, their identities reduced to a single racial category. Yet, these stories did not disappear entirely. They lived on in family traditions, whispered stories, and cultural practices that hinted at deeper roots. Today, as genetic testing and historical research offer new tools for exploring ancestry, many African Americans are rediscovering and reclaiming their Native American heritage. This process is more than an academic exercise. It is a powerful act of self-definition and historical justice. By unraveling this hidden narrative, we gain a fuller understanding of what it means to be African American. The story is not just one of forced migration and enslavement, but also of interconnection, survival, and the blending of diverse culture. This rediscovery asks us to confront uncomfortable truths about the erasure of Native identities, and to celebrate the resilience of those who carried these legacies forward. Could this hidden history reshape how we view African American identity? What does it mean to reclaim a heritage that was almost lost? As we peel back the layers of this complex ancestry, we are reminded that history is rarely as simple as it seems, and that understanding our roots can transform how we see ourselves today. Long before the transatlantic slave trade and the arrival of European settlers, the Americas were home to thriving indigenous communities. Among these were native black Indians, indigenous people of darker skin tones, whose histories are often overlooked in traditional narratives. These communities were part of the intricate mosaic of North America's pre-colonial societies, each with its own language, culture, and traditions. Yet, following European colonization, their identities began to fade from historical record. What happened to these native black Indians? The answer lies in a combination of systemic erasure, enslavement, and forced assimilation. European settlers, upon arriving in the New World, encountered diverse indigenous populations, many of whom bore physical traits, including darker skin tones, that led Europeans to misclassify them. As colonization spread, so too did the practice of enslaving native peoples. Millions of indigenous individuals were captured and sold into slavery, often shipped to the Caribbean, Europe, and Africa. In turn, when these enslaved Native Americans were reintroduced to the Americas, they were labeled as African slaves, their true heritage hidden beneath the weight of colonial bureaucracy and systemic racism. The transatlantic slave trade, which primarily transported enslaved Africans, obscured the parallel histories of indigenous enslavement. During the 16th and 17th centuries, European colonizers, particularly in regions like the Carolinas and New England, enslaved thousands of Native Americans. This dark chapter of history is now recognized as the Indian slave trade. Unlike African slaves, native captives were often sent to distant lands, severing their ties to their communities and erasing their cultural identities. Over generations, native black Indians found themselves caught in a liminal space. Some were absorbed into African American communities, forming bonds of survival and shared oppression with enslaved Africans. Others maintained connections to their indigenous roots, passing down oral histories, traditions, and a sense of belonging that defied colonial attempts at erasure. Yet, as these communities intermarried and blended, their distinct identities became harder to trace. Colonial authorities exacerbated this erasure through policies that sought to simplify racial classifications. People of mixed African and Native descent were often recorded as colored or black in census records and legal documents, effectively stripping them of their native identities. By the 19th century, native black Indians had largely vanished from official narratives, their existence relegated to folklore and family stories. This erasure was not without resistance. Many families preserved their indigenous heritage through storytelling, spiritual practices, and cultural traditions. In regions like the southeastern United States, where tribes such as the Cherokee, Creek, and Seminole had long-standing ties to African American communities, these connections endured despite the pressures of assimilation. For example, the Seminole Nation is renowned for its alliances with runaway African slaves, who became known as Black Seminoles. Together, they resisted colonization, forming a unique cultural and military bond that continues to be celebrated today. The rediscovery of native Black Indians' history is not just a matter of academic interest. It is a vital part of understanding the complexity of African American identity. Genetic testing and historical research are now shedding light on the depth of these connections, confirming what many African American families have known for generations: that their roots extend beyond Africa, intertwining with the rich and diverse heritage of Native America. By reclaiming the history of native Black Indians, we gain a fuller picture of America's past, one that celebrates the resilience and adaptability of its people in the face of unimaginable challenges. This forgotten chapter is a testament to the enduring power of heritage and the human spirit's ability to transcend even the harshest circumstances. The Indian slave trade stands as one of the most overlooked, yet devastating aspects of colonial history. Between the 17th and 18th centuries, the systematic enslavement of Native Americans reshaped the demographic and cultural fabric of North America. While the transatlantic slave trade brought millions of Africans to the Americas, historical records reveal that, during certain periods, more Native Americans were exported as slaves than Africans were imported. This tragic trade decimated indigenous populations and laid the groundwork for racial hierarchies that persist to this day. Colonial powers, including the British, French, and Spanish, heavily relied on the enslavement of native peoples to build their new territories. Tribes such as the Pequot, Yamasee, and Appalachee were among the first to experience large-scale enslavement. These captives were often sent to labor in the sugar plantations of the Caribbean, or shipped to Europe to serve as domestic workers. The ports of Boston, Charleston, and New Orleans became major hubs for this human trafficking, with ships carrying indigenous slaves out of the continent in staggering numbers. What made Native Americans particularly vulnerable to enslavement was their deep familiarity with the land. European settlers saw them as both a labor source and a strategic obstacle. Entire tribes were targeted during colonial wars, with survivors enslaved and their lands seized. For example, the Yamasee War of 1715-1717, fought between European settlers and southeastern tribes, resulted in the mass enslavement and displacement of thousands of indigenous people. These captives were sold to plantations in the West Indies, where the harsh conditions led to high mortality rates and further loss of cultural identity. The devastating impact of the Indian slave trade went beyond the physical removal of individuals. It shattered social structures as tribes were pitted against one another. Colonial powers often incentivized some tribes to capture and sell their neighbors. For instance, the Chickasaw and Creek were coerced into acting as intermediaries, hunting rival tribes to provide slaves to European traders. This practice not only decimated entire communities, but also sowed seeds of distrust and division that lingered long after the trade ended. Over time, as the African slave trade grew in scale and profitability, the enslavement of Native Americans began to decline. However, its effects were far-reaching. Many indigenous people who survived enslavement found themselves reclassified by colonial authorities. Those who intermarried with Africans were often stripped of their native identity and labeled as Negro or colored in official records. This bureaucratic erasure further compounded the loss of cultural heritage, leaving descendants with little trace of their ancestral roots. The legacy of the Indian slave trade is still visible today. Many African Americans and Native Americans share a common history of oppression and resilience. Genetic studies and oral histories reveal that a significant portion of African Americans carry indigenous DNA, underscoring the intertwined fates of these communities. Recovering this hidden history is essential, not only for understanding the past, but also for fostering connections between African American and Native American communities. By acknowledging the shared experiences of slavery, survival, and adaptation, we can honor the memory of those who endured and recognize the complex tapestry of American ancestry. As the Indian slave trade declined and the transatlantic importation of African slaves grew, a new dynamic began to emerge. On plantations and in frontier settlements, Native Americans and Africans, often placed together under the yoke of forced labor, formed connections that transcended cultural boundaries. This blending of communities gave rise to a significant population of mixed heritage individuals, whose identities defied the simplistic racial classifications imposed by colonial societies. The process of cultural fusion was neither accidental nor purely incidental. In many cases, Native Americans and Africans found solidarity in shared struggles against oppression. Both groups faced brutal treatment at the hands of colonial powers, including forced labor, cultural erasure, and displacement from their lands. In the face of these adversities, they leaned on one another, sharing knowledge, customs, and survival strategies. Intermarriage between African slaves and Native Americans was common in many regions of North America, particularly in the Southeast. Tribes such as the Seminole, Creek, and Cherokee often provided refuge for escaped African slaves, integrating them into their communities. These alliances were not only practical, but also deeply transformative, as the descendants of these unions inherited rich, dual heritages that blended African traditions with native customs. However, colonial authorities actively sought to undermine these cross-cultural connections. The existence of mixed heritage populations posed a challenge to the rigid racial hierarchies that underpinned the colonial economy. Laws were enacted to classify all individuals with African ancestry as black, regardless of their indigenous roots. For example, the one-drop rule cemented the idea that even minimal African ancestry negated any claim to native or European identity. This bureaucratic erasure stripped mixed heritage individuals of their multifaceted identities, reducing them to a single homogenized category. The consequences of this racial categorization were profound. Over generations, African Americans with native ancestry were often disconnected from their indigenous roots. Tribal affiliations, languages, and cultural practices were lost, leaving many descendants unaware of their native heritage. Meanwhile, native communities faced increasing pressure to conform to European standards of Indianness to maintain their legal status as tribes, further alienating those with African lineage. Despite these challenges, the legacy of mixed heritage endured in subtle yet powerful ways. Folklore, cuisine, spiritual practices, and music often reflected a blending of African and native influences. For instance, the call and response, singing styles, common in African American spirituals, echo similar traditions found in Native American ceremonies. Likewise, culinary staples such as cornbread and gumbo bear the marks of both African and native contributions, illustrating the deep interconnectedness of these cultures. In recent years, advancements in genetic testing and a renewed interest in genealogy have led many African Americans to rediscover their native ancestry. This awakening has sparked a movement to reclaim lost identities and honor the complexities of their heritage. For some, this journey involves reconnecting with tribal communities and learning about indigenous traditions. For others, it means advocating for broader recognition of the shared histories that bind African Americans and Native Americans together. The rise of mixed heritage among African Americans is a testament to the resilience and adaptability of marginalized communities. It challenges the simplistic narratives of race that have long dominated American history, offering a more nuanced and inclusive understanding of identity. By embracing this complexity, we can celebrate the rich tapestry of cultures that define the American experience. The history of African Americans is traditionally framed as beginning with the transatlantic slave trade, but some scholars argue for a far older connection between Africans and the Americas. Evidence from historical records, oral traditions, and artifacts suggests that Africans may have reached the New World long before Columbus's arrival in 1492. If true, this revelation challenges established narratives and underscores the deep and multifaceted roots of African American heritage. One of the most compelling theories points to the Mali Empire, a powerful West African kingdom that flourished during the 13th and 14th centuries. According to accounts by Arab historians, such as Al-Umari, Emperor Mansa Abu Bakari II embarked on a transatlantic expedition in the early 14th century. Driven by a desire to explore the open sea, Abu Bakari reportedly sent a fleet of ships westward, with some scholars theorizing that these voyages reached the Americas. Though concrete evidence remains elusive, the possibility of such an endeavor hints at an ancient African presence on the continent. Artifacts and cultural parallels provide additional support for this theory. For instance, pre-Columbian sculptures and carvings in Mesoamerica, such as the Olmec heads, feature distinctively African facial features, including broad noses and full lips. While mainstream archaeologists caution against over-interpreting these similarities, proponents argue that they reflect transatlantic contact between African civilizations and indigenous peoples of the Americas. Linguistic studies also point to potential African influence. Some Native American languages, particularly in the Caribbean and South America, contain words and phrases with striking similarities to West African languages. This overlap suggests a possible exchange of knowledge and culture that predates European colonization. Additionally, agricultural practices and tools found in the Americas bear a resemblance to those used in Africa, further hinting at ancient connection. Oral stories passed down among both African and indigenous communities lend further weight to these claims. In parts of Central and South America, legends speak of black-skinned people arriving from the sea, bringing with them advanced knowledge of navigation and trade. Similarly, some African oral traditions recount tales of voyages across the Atlantic, suggesting a mutual recognition of ancient encounters. Skeptics argue that these parallels could result from independent development rather than direct contact. However, the sheer volume of overlapping evidence challenges this notion, inviting a deeper exploration of the historical relationships between Africans and the Americas. Whether through deliberate exploration or accidental voyages, it is plausible that African travelers reached the New World, leaving traces of their presence in the cultural and genetic fabric of the region. If African civilizations did indeed interact with indigenous peoples of the Americas, the implications for African American identity are profound. Such a connection would establish African Americans as inheritors of a legacy that predates the horrors of slavery, tying them to a history of exploration, ingenuity, and resilience. It would also highlight the interconnectedness of global cultures, emphasizing the shared human drive for discovery and exchange. Today, as researchers and historians delve deeper into these theories, they are met with both fascination and controversy. The potential African presence in ancient America is not merely a matter of historical curiosity. It is a narrative that redefines the roots of African American heritage. By embracing these possibilities, we can foster a richer and more inclusive understanding of history, one that celebrates the contributions of Africans to the tapestry of the Americas long before European conquest. In recent years, African Americans have been reclaiming their complex heritage, uncovering stories that reveal the intertwined histories of African, Native American, and European ancestry. Advances in genetic testing, renewed interest in historical research, and efforts to preserve cultural traditions have empowered individuals and communities to redefine their identities. This rediscovery is not just about ancestry, it's about understanding the resilience, contributions, and cultural wealth of a people whose stories were long silenced. Modern genetic testing has become a powerful tool for uncovering hidden ancestry. Companies like 23andMe in Ancestridna allow African Americans to explore their DNA, often revealing unexpected ties to Native American tribes. These connections challenge the singular narrative of African American origins, emphasizing the diverse and multifaceted histories that shape identity. For many, the discovery of native roots sparks a journey of cultural reconnection, learning about tribal customs, languages, and histories that had been erased or forgotten. Oral traditions remain a cornerstone in reclaiming this heritage. Many African American families have passed down stories of Native American ancestry through generations. Grandparents' tales of ancestors who lived as Black Indians or tribal affiliations that were hidden during periods of racial segregation are now being revisited with fresh eyes. These narratives, once dismissed or overshadowed by the dominant history of slavery, are being validated and celebrated. Communities are also working to revive the cultural practices of their Native and African ancestors. From foodways to spiritual ceremonies, these traditions are being woven into the fabric of modern African American identity. For instance, the rediscovery of indigenous farming techniques or herbal medicine practices connects African Americans not only to their ancestors, but also to sustainable and communal ways of living that are deeply relevant today. This reclamation is not without its challenges. The erasure of Native American ancestry in African American history was deliberate, a product of colonial policies that sought to simplify and control racial classifications. By designating mixed heritage individuals as Black, colonial authorities sought to undermine indigenous sovereignty and simplify the racial hierarchy of slavery. This historical manipulation created barriers to understanding and claiming one's full heritage. Today, addressing this erasure requires challenging entrenched narratives and demanding a more inclusive account of history. Grassroots movements are playing a pivotal role in reclaiming this heritage. Organizations and activists are advocating for the recognition of Black Indians and mixed heritage individuals within Native American tribes. This advocacy includes efforts to secure tribal membership for descendants who were excluded due to racial bias or outdated enrollment criteria. These movements are not just about legal recognition. They are about restoring a sense of belonging and affirming the right to claim a shared history. Educating the broader public is a crucial step in this process. Schools, museums, and cultural institutions are beginning to include the histories of African native peoples in their curricula and exhibits. Documentaries, books, and social media platforms are also spreading awareness, making these stories accessible to a wider audience. This education is vital for dismantling stereotypes and fostering a more nuanced understanding of African American and Native American histories. Ultimately, the reclamation of African American heritage is a testament to resilience. It acknowledges the strength of ancestors who endured displacement, enslavement, and erasure, yet preserved fragments of their identities through stories, traditions, and community bonds. By piecing together these fragments, modern descendants honor their forebears and ensure their legacies endure. As we move forward, this process of rediscovery and reclamation invites a profound question. How do we define identity in a world shaped by complex histories and shared experiences? The answer lies not in choosing one ancestry over another, but in embracing the richness of all our roots. African Americans, who trace their lineage to both Africa and Native America, are rewriting the narrative of who they are, not just as descendants of oppression, but as inheritors of a legacy of survival, innovation, and cultural fusion. This journey of rediscovery is far from over. Each step, whether through personal exploration, community advocacy, or public education, brings us closer to a fuller understanding of the past and its significance for the future. What hidden stories remain to be uncovered? And how can we use these stories to build a more inclusive and connected world? Let's continue this conversation. What does heritage mean to you? How do we honor the stories of our ancestors while forging new paths forward? Share your thoughts and join the movement to celebrate the full spectrum of our collective history.